start now. Dr. Muir, you can start now.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Executive Lecture Series at William Patterson University. It is my great pleasure to introduce Mr. Sunil Roberts, who is a global executive with over 25 years experience in the area of corporate communication and management in general. He currently is heading a division in marketing in a division in Tata Consultancy Services, and he has extensive experience in other corporate spheres, including in Oracle and elsewhere. Much before he became a corporate executive, he was a student in the city of Hyderabad in India, which is where I met him. So it has been a delight for me to watch him grow into this extraordinary position as a communicator and a leader. Mr. Robert is also a member of the Toastmasters International Club, and we hope that he will be facilitating the entry of William Patterson University into the world of Toastmasters at some point in the future. Mr. Robert will be speaking to us on crisis management in a social media world, and I really look forward to learning from him, as I hope do all of you. Please feel free to engage him with as many questions as possible, but I request you to hold your questions till the end and to use the mics so that our online audience, which is considerable, will be able to hear your question and participate in some way in the discussion. So without further ado, Sunil Robert, give him a hand, please.
Check. Thank you, Professor Raza, for that warm and wonderful introduction. My first name is Sunil, and it means sunshine. And I'm hoping in some way my name will liven up your mood, considering the weather that we have outside. And I hope to also follow the number one public speaking rule or teaching rule, which is try and be brief. Because then if you can't earn your audience's respect, at least you would have earned their gratitude. So although Professor Raza indicated to me that I could go up to 35, 40 minutes, I intend keeping it much shorter so we have a fair amount of time for interaction. But sometimes in the flow, speakers tend to just get swept away, and that's when you could potentially give me some visual cues as to how you're doing. So I want to get started. How are you today, this evening? Good? Hopefully the weather would not deter us. The reason I chose this topic, when all hell breaks loose, is because there is, in the business world, almost a kind of an eggshell scenario where most executives are almost dreading every day as to what crisis might unfold from whatever quarters unexpected most times. So in marketing, as somebody who are supposedly the brand custodians of the brands that we represent, we as marketing communicators are always in the front line of activity whenever a crisis breaks out. You just look at the business newspapers every day, you'd see some brand or the other facing some bit of a crisis or the other. So my session today is called When All Hell Breaks Loose. How do you kind of manage? How do you react? What are some of the best practices that I could advise? And more importantly, towards the end of the session, I want to spend a few minutes talking to you about individual young upcoming professionals as to what it might mean to you on an individual level, not just as marketing or communication professionals. I've had I wouldn't call the joy of managing crisis, because that would be as if I'm looking around for crisis to go and manage. I had the misfortune or the experience of having managed a couple of fairly complex crises in my journey as a brand custodian. The first one happened when I worked in a company which, and I'll share a little bit of the background here, was a Citigroup company. Now, Citigroup, or Citibank, as most of you would know, had multiple venture capital companies invested all over the world, and the company that I've worked for happened to be one of them. So in some way, they were our parent, we were the child company, and we were doing some interesting work in India. We were India's first product software company. So if any of you are following the technology space, Indian companies have suddenly come upon the global scene, and mostly they were known for outsourcing, helping big banks, helping big airline companies, helping big retail companies in the United States change their technology. And so Indians became very synonymous with outsourcing and projects and so on and so forth. But we were slightly different. Our company, the company that I worked for, created its first intellectual property, and we were called the first ever product company that came out of India. So in a sense, it had some bit of pride associated with it, some bit of a cult-like aura associated with us. We were very successful as a company as well. In a very short time of about 8-10 years, 300 customers across 100 countries. US happened to be one of the countries that we were there, but we were pretty much all over the map. I mean, for example, we were in New Zealand. We were in the Middle East. We were in Africa. Africa, as you all know, was considered to be a dark continent from a technology standpoint as well. But this company that I work for, iFlex, went into Africa as well. So very successful. The senior leaders were based in not far from here on Park Avenue. And we had 3 different entities, one in Europe, one in Singapore, and much of our employee base was in India. A very interesting company to work for. In fact, if we came to your campus and 10 other companies came to your campus to work for, there would be competition among the children or the younger kids to see if they could be picked by us. Because while most people would come to America to work, our employees would go to really exotic countries. They would just travel the world. At that age, the world travel, the ability to go and impact banks and financial institutions around the world seemed like a very interesting appeal for many young people. So we really had a great thing going before the first crisis hit. The wedding crisis. I don't know if you follow the wedding ceremonies very intensely, but there is almost like an outdated tradition when the priest or the pastor asks the church just before the important moment, is there anyone in this audience, if there's an objection that these two should not be married? And then he pauses for a minute. To me, that's the most deafening, that's the most heartbreaking time in a wedding. You know, if that could be the moment where anything could fall apart, particularly if any of the two partners happen to have not so blemishless track record. So iFlex as a company was on the threshold of being listed, and we were going to go public, which meant some of us could have potentially become rich because we were all employees and we all would get shares, and we could have become rich. So this whole notion of India's first iFlex, a product software company going public, was very exciting for a lot of us. Employees, investors were very, very excited because India could finally have its own Oracle, or finally could have its own Microsoft, or what the future could have been. But very exciting times. We went through the whole process. We filed, and the books opened. We were in what is known as a cooling period. And that's when all hell broke loose for us. A big bank to whom we supplied software went to the media and said, I'm suing this company. This company makes nothing but garbage. This software doesn't work. And just pause there and think of all the implications that it could mean for us as employees, for potential investors who wanted to invest into this company, for the regulators. What do they do when somebody comes up and says, I'm suing this company? It has legal and compliance-related implications. Then it also has implications on our competitors. The competitors were having a field day because, look, one of your own customers is saying that you suck. Here's the newspaper publication. It went to all our competitors. It went to all the competitors, took it to all our customers. In other words, we were not having a great day. At that point, the leaders had a clear choice to make. Do you think this is a one-off crisis and then just move on? Because there are about 299 other customers who are happy, right? Or do you go plow through this and pay a price? So it's really, like all crises, this was a very complex crisis with multiple implications for multiple stakeholders. So if you were the marketing manager, if you were the communications or the PR director of that company, how would your mind start playing out? What plans would you have to start thinking out? So I'd like you to hold that thought on the back of your mind. Do you attack and say, hey, this customer is a liar? And what message might that send to the 299 other customers? Should there be a legal or some kind of a misunderstanding between them? How would you treat? Do you go on the defensive? If you go on the defensive, what messages or mixed signals might that send? Right? But if you are defensive and you're silent, silent might mean admission to guilt. Yes or no? So what strategies would we formulate? And there's no clear yes or no or a straight path in such crises. And you will discover that in a short while. So this was really the first crisis that we waited. And another important aspect to bear in mind was when you are in the cooling period, or when you are in the quiet period, as the technical term is called, you cannot make advertisements. You cannot make public announcements. It's cooling time. It's silent time. You have to be silent. Those were the regulations issued by the stock exchanges with whom we signed up saying, we'll get listed in your stock exchanges, which means you're legally, contractually, and in many other ways bound. So it's like you were thrown into a fencing match with your hands tied. And the opponent is really taking swipes at you. So that was the first crisis I managed. I'll come back to the solutions in a minute, but let me paint the picture for what happened in the second story. The second story is even more interesting, because if the first one was fought within India with some spillages into the United States and other competitors and customers in other parts of the world, much of our operating space was in India. But here, it really went global. In the second crisis, what happened was, remember I told you about how this company had 3 subsidiaries, one United States, one in Europe, and one in Singapore for Asia Pac? The Europe CEO was arrested. One morning, we just got a call into our Mumbai offices saying that our CEO is arrested. And that's when, again, as I said, all hell broke loose. What happened was the Netherlands government issued an extradition treaty to arrest our CEO, who was based in London. Now, usually, extradition treaties are reserved for international traffickers, smugglers, and criminals of the worst order, not a high-flying, jet-setting executive. But it was. And due to a series of unfortunate circumstances, the Crown Police in the United Kingdom arrested him and put him in a prison called the Brixton prison for a few days. And because of that, for the next few days, there was huge furor in India. All the newspapers started taking the nationalistic stance, saying Indian executives are being targeted overseas. And then they just went jingoistic, they went ballistic, and they started attacking the British government, they started attacking the Dutch government, and they started playing this India versus rest of the world. There was like cross-border protectionism at play. They're restricting our mobility as we go global. So that narrative was playing out in the media. But as a communicator, as a PR director, and our leadership team, our senior guys, our first priority was what? Whom do we need to get out of prison? our senior leader is rotting away for a few days in prison. Not the best place to be if you're a CEO. So our goal, immediate goal, was to get the Dutch extradition request canceled. And I'm a PR guy. I didn't study international affairs. I didn't study diplomacy. I didn't work for the United Nations. I had no idea about how these international deals and cross-border issues work out and play out. But anyway, with a lot of learning on the fly, our goal, primary goal, was to get the extradition request canceled and get our CEO out, and then take on the Dutch government and figure out why that extradition request came and what happened. The second thing that was at stake was there were a few banks of ours, existing customers in the Netherlands, that had bought a lot of our software. So anything we might do as an attack strategy in Netherlands or in Amsterdam would impact the revenue from those customers and also potentially affect our global sales strategy. So think of that on the back of your mind. Our response to the Dutch extradition request would actually impact our go-to-market strategy, our business strategy, our ability to do future business in Europe. And then finally, we also had this whole competition playing out that we as a company violated certain visa-related, compliance-related issues, and therefore our brand was taking a beating. So if you were the PR person, or you were managing the social media, and you're seeing all these tweets and all these Facebook postings and all these LinkedIn announcements, what are some of the things that might play out in your mind as strategies? So I'll share what we did, combining these two and some of our learnings. The first thing in a crisis is, there are 5 stages of coping with grief, right? What is the first thing that people get into a mode of? A denial mode. This can't be happening to us. We are the #1 product software company from India. We've been #1 for so many years. This can't be happening to us. How could it happen to us? Initially, that was our reaction, but we knew that we didn't have time to waste over denial. We knew that if we had to get our narrative right, we have to be communicating, not let media, not let competitors, not let others take over the narrative. So the first rule in communication is, in a crisis particularly, you need to keep the communication lines and channels consistently open. There were times when we had no information to give to the media. I would go out, our senior leaders would go out and say, look, since we updated you 24 hours ago, the status quo remains the same. We do not have any fresh updates. So they will just take that soundbite and say, this is what has happened, this is what the company said, the company continues to maintain this stance that there's no fresh information. What tends to happen is when there's no information, people go into a shut-off mode, and then everybody starts speculating. So the first thing we needed to do, both in the time when a client went public and said, our software sucks, and then they wanted to sue us for an exorbitant amount of money, to the time when our CEO was stuck and then this diplomatic crisis broke over, we guided the narrative. That's the first thing we should learn in crisis communication. First, acknowledge that there was an issue, and then we start talking. Now, watch me. I'm not saying admit to it. I'm not saying admit to the crisis. I'm saying acknowledge there is a crisis. And the big problem with corporations is that they somehow feel the moment you acknowledge the issue, you're admitting to guilt. It is not so. Just acknowledge the issue, and then I'll connect on that part towards the end again. The moment you acknowledge, a whole lot of energy gets dissipated from the crisis. And I saw that in both those narratives that played out. The second one was to really watch out, particularly in cross-communication across cultures. The Dutch have a different culture. The Brits have a different culture. We who are playing out this narrative from India come from a different culture. We Indians tend to be a little emotional. And you should have caught that by now. We put our heart, soul, and mind into everything. So when this the customer scenario played out, our first reaction was, how could this bank, where 300 of our guys went and put their blood, sweat, and toil, could turn around and threaten to sue us? You know, it just takes one disgruntled client to spoil your story. Just one bad apple or one bad customer experience. So we knew that we had to acknowledge that these things happen. So when we started telling the story about the customer threatening to sue us as well as the diplomatic crisis, we started talking at multiple levels. The first thing we did was we really used the mass media well, particularly in the second instance, because we didn't have the limitation of a silent period or a quiet period holding us back. In the first crisis, there was this legal silent time where we could not respond. And so the customer went on bad-mouthing us in the press. So we let it pass till the time the gates would be open for us to communicate. We waited, we bided our time. In the meantime, he ran out of gas, and then when we were able to tell our version, people really respected the fact that we held our patience and we were willing to work. And I'll tell you how you could get around some of these legal and complex compliance-related issues and skirting some of them and come up with other ways of communicating your same message using other customers who are not legally bound to speak on your behalf. So I'll talk a little about that towards the end. The last one, the last couple of ones I wanted to tie to, involving all the big guns and telling your track record and story was something that we really wanted to play up. Remember I told you we had 300 customers across 100 countries. We kept hammering that message right from our chairman to as someone as low as at my level. We just went to town with that narrative. Everybody had the same script. Everybody had the same messaging book. Everybody had the same responses. So even if the media tried to catch any one of us, the same story would play out, different levels, different voices. So our consistency in message, our ability to stick to our corporate track record, our success, really set us up high so that the world knew that if these guys are so successful, this must be an aberration. If these guys can go into countries where they don't even have telecommunication infrastructure, like countries like in Africa, and set up this banking software, then this must be. So this ability to create the benefit of doubt in your favor is the first step in you win the first battle there, right there. Your ability to stick to your track record. And how we used some of those I'll share with you now. Because we were from Citigroup and our parentage was from Citigroup, we really leveraged the Citigroup branding, the ability to get some of that brand sheen rubbed off onto us. For example, as a company, there were certain best practices that we learned from the Citigroup in the way we managed our employees, in the way we managed government, in the way we complied with state, federal, and international compliance-related issues, in the way we did our accounting, in the way we did. So everything that we did had some kind of a parent supervision from Citigroup. So that really was something that we were able to put both in our crisis responses as well as in our business plans. The second and the third thing the elements that really supported our narrative in those getting our CEO out of prison, as well as fighting the backlash that came when your client stands up and says your software does not work, was the ability to go and call upon the good offices of our customers. All the clients with whom we've done great work and had outstanding relationships is like, come on, man, so many years we got your back. It's time for you to step up and speak. And so many of our customers who are bankers, very conservative folks, who would never go out in public and make any kind of statement, they were the ones who rallied and supported us in that time of crisis. Both personal life as well as even in corporate life, one of the things we need to realize is if your track record has been consistent and strong, there will be times when there will be some crisis moments, and that's the time you can dip back into your story, into your track record, into your past credentials, and get yourself out of that hole. So the ability for us as a company to really put together a team of people who are very strong on law, who are very strong on international cultural nuances, our ability to work the diplomatic corridors. For example, we really needed the Indian government to kind of support us and get our back when we had to get this CEO out of prison, right? So Indian government at that time was really very pro-business and pro-information technology and pro-startup kind of a mindset. They really were getting our back. They really said, look, if this is the kind of treatment that Indian companies are going to deal with, if they come and do business, then as Indian government, we really strongly denounce it. So when Indian government made a statement, the Dutch government paid attention. We were a very small company. $650 million company is no big deal to Netherlands. But because the government of India made a public denunciation of this arrest that happened, the Dutch government took serious effect. The Indian High Commissioner called the Dutch Commissioner, the Dutch High Council into a diplomatic meeting and asked for an explanation as to what transpired. Why did this happen? Why was not any sufficient notice given to the Indian company? How could, so really at the highest levels, communication started happening. And then, I learned it much later, we knew that we had to ask for a big favor from the British government. Because if they want to, geographically, Netherlands and Britain are much closer and they have a stronger affinity to each other than India and Britain. Although India and Britain also have a strong, they ruled us for a couple of centuries, right? But because of their geographic proximity, the favor we were asking the British government of letting our guy go was going to be a no or an insult or an affront to the Dutch government. So we were really asking the British government to pull off something that they would have probably not done for a long time, or it was unprecedented. But we were able to pull that off. The reason we were able to do that, I discovered that much later, is what happens in diplomacy and international cross-cultural affairs is that they give something and they get back something. We discovered that much later, that a prisoner, a British prisoner who was languishing in an Indian prison for 20, 25 years, it's a very famous case called the Purulia Arms, where a British pilot was caught and he was languishing in a jail in India, and Indian government was sitting on a request to provide insulin medicines, a request that came from the British channels. So Indian guy said, you know what, this request that's been sitting with us, we'll clear this, get our guy out. It's like children, right? You give me this, I give you that. So to cut a long story short, our primary objective of getting our CEO out was done, and then we went on the offensive on why this Dutch government set out this extradition request, which impacted our businesses, which impacted our employees who were there. All the employees had to be flown back, which meant all our existing engagements with those banks for which the employees were in the first place suffered, which meant a lot of contingency planning and backup activity had to be done. So to cut a long story short, we really went on the offensive to find out, and we dug deeper, and then we discovered it was actually a disgruntled employee that we had hired who went to the Dutch interior departments and then just alleged about some visa misuse. See, one disgruntled employee can just bring a company to its knees. Whether it's in retail or whether it's business to business, if you're not careful, crisis can strike a corporation from anywhere. And that's why, like the Boy Scout, you have to be prepared. Anytime you're operating in any country, you've got to realize that there are some elements at risk, and then you have a crisis plan in place. So to kind of round up, we really had a template for every geography. For example, if Europe, there's something cooking, we would have a crisis management in fully developed, fully rotated out. Who are the executives that we need to tap into locally and as well as back at the headquarters? We really had a fairly well thought out communication strategy in place. Having learned our lessons, those two big examples, we really had a time where many executives came together and said, how can we learn from this experience and come to as a brand? And we discovered that if we have to cut our losses, then there are times when you have to take the path of least resistance. So with the client, we went into a mediation process, and we settled, because if you attack a client, you might win the battle, but you will end up losing the war. Because that will send a strong message to the other customers that they will also be in the same place should a legal dispute come up, right? So we chose the high ground, and we said, look, for all the alleged stuff that you accused us of, this is what we could do. These are the facts, and we went into a mediation process. Like the same thing we did with the Dutch government. In the thick of crisis, everybody said, let's sue the Dutch government, let's get them. We're trying to help their nation, we're trying to build the banks in that country, let's try and do this. But as the emotions simmered and everybody cooled off, we realized that it's not as easy as it looks. Legal litigation can be a long, drawn process. It can drain your company's resources. It'll drain your personal resources. People have to show up in court, and people have to prepare legal counsels and so on and so forth. So even there, we tried to cut our losses and try and, because what was most important in that country was how do we resume business as usual with the banks with whom we had already contracted to implement software. Because they paid us money, we took their money, and the imperative was that we go back and get back to work. So how we ended up closing all the conflict issues and got back to business as usual was also a similar mindset. Get your customers back to that. Things are back to normal. Everything is business as usual. So those were some of the key lessons we learned during our a few tips, and then I'll see if we are pretty much near the gratitude mark that I talked to you about. I personally believe, both as a professional and also as an individual, and that's what I teach to everyone who cares to listen, is truth always. Because in a crisis, our first impulse is to what? Cover up, lie. Sometimes you don't do it with the intent to cheat, but to just make us look good, or just to avoid the ignominy of the fact that we made a mistake. So if you're able to just own it up, suck it up, and just say, yes, there is an issue, get the truth out, then it'll really change the game about crisis. Both mini crisis, international crisis, any crisis, the principle is the same. Truth and speed. Stakeholders care about what's being done, not so much as outcomes. As PR guys, we sometimes come under pressure because we are not able to give satisfying answers to all the stakeholders. Media guys would line up outside my office in Mumbai or wherever I was, just asking for the most recent update. But I would find it very difficult to give them any more update than what I already have, because I can't fabricate information just to satisfy them. So there would be times when I would just go back and say, sorry guys, I don't have any more information than what I've told you 2 days ago or yesterday. Status quo, this is what it is. We put out this request, and then it'll take time, and then we just wait. We wait over. So our ability to keep the conversation going was critical to managing that crisis. I talked to you about how some bit of sheen was taken off our brand because of those crises. We were scarred. Some of us were scarred. Particularly the family. Just imagine the family of the executive who was arrested. They carry that emotional scar, right? we all had emotional investment into it. In fact, the guy who got arrested was the very guy who hired me. So I was personally more invested in that crisis. And for some of us who were very, it took a while for us to wrap our minds around this, because who in their right mind would want to face a crisis of this magnitude? But we came through. We came through because we knew track record would bail us out. In fact, there's a very interesting story about that executive. 6 months prior to that unfortunate incident, the Prime Minister of Britain at that time, Tony Blair, came to India on a trade mission. And he had dinner with a few top up-and-coming young executives who were under a particular age. Around, I think it was about 45 or something. So a very famous cricketer, a very famous lady dancer, some folks from the media, some folks from the business world were called to have that exclusive dinner with the Prime Minister. And an invitation was sent to our company, and it so happened that because our chairman, like I said, lived in the US, they had to depute a much younger executive, and this very guy ended up at the Tony Blair dinner. So we used that factoid that, look, if you guys put a person of this stature in prison, and we use that photographic and other evidences to say, these are kind of guys you put in prison. Look at the track record. He had dinner with your Prime Minister. So our ability to go back and dip anecdotal and other pieces of evidence to contribute to our overarching narrative was really a key element in our success story. All the big guys were invested, right from our chairman, who was sitting in the New York City office, was willing to fly to London, was willing to get to India, get in front of the diplomats and tell our story. Because if the chairman of the company is sitting in front of you and telling the story, then you have pretty much the whole voice and the credentials of that company right in front of you. So we were able to get everybody. And then I repeat that same thing. Emotional intelligence was key in managing these cross-cultural dialogues. We knew that if we got very aggressive, the other party also gets aggressive. Then you'll harden your stance in the ground, and then there will be very less scope for a peaceful solution, because conflicts like these can be long drawn. So even when you are in a crisis, in an individual crisis, you're taking on a bank, you're taking on your cell phone company, pick your battles. Do not invest your time in mindless, draining experiences. Try and see whether if you can take the high road and just get out of those situations. Bottom line, our experience because of those two crises was that our employee base became very, very energized. They knew that if any of those 6,000 employees ever got into a situation anywhere, the message they got was the chairman of the company and downward, everybody would come and rally to their rescue. So internal communication and internal motivation really surged after that crisis. So as a brand, we experienced a plethora of benefits, particularly we went through these two crises. So those two experiences really shaped our DNA as a company. And we're living in a very social media intense world. One tweet, anybody's account could be hacked and wrong messages could be sent, right? Your identity could be hacked and your computers, your phones, everything could be jammed. So to bring it home, I'd like you to start thinking of what are the worst things that could happen to my telephone, my bank accounts, my reputation online, and start thinking of having a social media plan in place. Who are some of the first people whom you should be calling upon to rescue your reputation online? What are some of the things that you should stand for so that people straight away know that if some wrong messages are posted online on your account, through your account, people straight away know that it's hacked? You need to set up those systems in place. What are some of the things you could do? Start wrapping your mind, because it's a crazy world out there. Just a couple of days ago in India, One of the top politicians, his account was hacked, and all sorts of weird humor, all sorts of almost self-deprecatory humor was inflicted on the Twitter universe. And I got to think, and I said, if a big gun like him is not spared, some of us are small fry. It could happen to us like that. So start thinking about what you say and how do you want to be seen, particularly as you approach employment and future plans in mind. What if a future employer mines your social media account? What are some of the critical words that come out? Is your social media narrative consistent with what you want to stand for or the direction that you want to take in your future? So these are some of the lessons that I learned based on the crises that I managed, and I want to be able to share that with you today. And before I wrap up, I just want to take a moment, just so that it doesn't sound like I'm sucking up to Professor, but I really want to thank you, Dr. Raza, for this wonderful opportunity. I learned a bit of public speaking from Professor Raza, who was involved in a public speaking club in Hyderabad. So if I let you down, I shouldn't be the one to be blamed. Thank you so very much. I'll pause here, and we'll see if we could continue the conversation through Q&A.
How about a hand? Okay, folks, those of you who have questions, I request you to come up here. Make sure the mic is on, and feel free. So while they are thinking of questions to ask, let me ask you the first question, Mr. Robert, which is that what is your understanding of how social media amplifies a crisis? And in fact, let me ask you, does it amplify a crisis? Because at one level, it is clear that something gets retweeted and retweeted a million times, but because of social media being intense as it is, sometimes the cycle shortens. So do you recommend that if there is something particularly egregious that hits you, should you just wait it out? That is one. And the second thing is that you are being very scrupulous and honest about these things, and you say truth first. But are there any benefits to sort of deflecting this crisis by doing something else and taking the attention elsewhere? I mean, purely as a strategy, I want to ask you.
Thank you for those two questions. I'll answer the first question about whether social media kind of amplifies and makes, because of the whole cycle of just going viral is the way news is being consumed. For example, earlier during the pre-social media revolution, people used to wait till the next day's newspaper or the next evening's news bulletin or something, which meant the corporations had some time to respond before they could manage the crisis. But because of the social media, the crises are almost played out real time, which means the dominant rule in social media is people don't let facts interfere with the conversation. People really don't have the time to wait for the facts. In fact, the moment people start posting things as status or tweeting and retweeting, one of the things that we need to do is go and do a fact check, a verified on either any sites or some credible sites where this kind of, at least it is not just somebody's vicious propaganda that's just starting out. Now, if I'm a bank, if I'm a company where my employees are there, the first thing that we need to check out is what is the way we can respond officially first, and then just see if we could watch out the narrative. And this is where I just want to talk to you about how do we use our strategy of deflection and what I've learned in all these crises and as a company, what I've discovered is if you if a journalist or some kind of a reporter or someone asked me for a response and I deflected it, my credibility suffers. Then I will not have the leverage because it's a two-way street. When I need to sell a story to a media, the currency that I'll be using is my own trust. Then you say, the last time you played me, why should I believe you, right? So deflecting can buy the corporation some time, so there are merits in the way you start talking about yours. It's a great strategy when you don't have the full facts around you. Let's say a reporter calls me and starts asking me, hey, is it true that your software in Brazil is completely destroyed the top 2 banks and thousands of ATMs are locked down, the Brazilians are struggling, I could pretty much use that deflection as a strategy at that time because I don't have the full facts with me. So I could just say, hey, look, in Latin America, this is my track record. I deflected to our track record and say we're serving about 12 countries across the region. These are the X number of customers. I provide them information. In the meantime, I go back and get my facts right. And if I try to get my facts from social media, that's where I'll be making a mistake, because I'm going into a wrong place to get my facts. My immediate facts have to be, where are the crisis points emerging from? In fact, the military has a nice acronym for crisis, the VUCA, V-U-C-A. Volatility, uncertainty. Anyone know that? No. All right, look it up. I just gave you 2. You can look up the other 2. VUCA, volatility, uncertainty, then you look up the other 2. So these 4 elements constitute what is a crisis. Now, if the situation is volatile, then deflection is a great idea because it's changing. You can't say something and then discover that what you said does not hold meaning anymore because the crisis and its dimensions have changed. Is it a crisis that plays out again and again, right? If you take on this banking and software kind of a thing, what if somebody has injected a virus that can actually impact in another country? So there's that uncertainty as well. So it plays out in different dimensions. So to just recap my answer, deflection is a great strategy when you don't have the full information at your disposal. And the earlier question was, social media is a really vicious place to be, and which is why truth finally triumphs, always triumphs. You need to come here, ma'am, please.
I just had a question about you personally. The software that you were designing for these companies, what purpose did they hold within the companies?
It's a software that will help them with their internet banking, payments. It's like the core of that bank.
So like FIS?
It's a bit like FIS,
Like a core
Fiserv, Jack Henry, yes.
Oh, okay.
So we were the first to come from India.
Oh,
And because these guys were so long in the banking industry, we just came like a new company and created this banking software, and then that really helped us succeed globally.
Okay.
That's a great question, though.
Mr. Sunil, good evening, Raphael. Question: your first incident, after you acknowledged the situation with your CEO who was in jail, how did you resolve the situation? What were the necessary steps? Like, summarize the steps for me. You said you acknowledged it, you didn't admit guilt, you had to get your CEO out, but you had to release a public statement. So how do you solve that problem?
Yeah. I alluded to a set of unfortunate circumstances. In a situation like when you, particularly when you're living in a foreign country, the first thing you should do is just deposit your passport and say, look, I'm going to be around, don't arrest me, which should have been the appropriate response for our executive at that time, right? But unfortunately, his passport was in the United States Embassy because he had applied for a US visa. So what would the opponent think? That he's trying to flee the country because he is guilty. So that unfortunate fact that he did not have the passport with him really led to this arrest. Otherwise, it could have been just treated like a white-collar a violation. Just through the diplomatic channels, it could have been resolved. But because he ended up in prison, so the first challenge was to get him out. So we applied through the diplomatic channels as well as the trade channels. We again spoke about how India is contributing to Britain, and therefore Indian trade, British trade will get affected. So they saw the big picture, and they got him out of that. So that was the first thing. Then we assured them that he will stay in Britain, he will cooperate with the British authorities, and we refused to go to Netherlands because we were not sure if he went to Netherlands, the right channels and the right processes would be followed. So our second battle was to get Britain to deny the extradition request, keep him in Britain itself. So that was the second battle. Yes?
You mentioned you have experience in marketing. You didn't have any previous legal experience. So how far did you go to learning about the law and the process and steps like this? Did you call a specialist, obviously lawyer or whatever?
Right.
How much hands-on were you?
That's a great question. I was purely managing the PR, media, and the international affairs part. I had a couple of senior colleagues who were managing the big picture from a legal standpoint, what messaging, because we didn't want to say anything that would, harden the stance of the Brits or the Dutch and so on. So every message had to be vetted both legally in India as well as in the United States, where our parent company was. And we had international trade experts in London helping us out. And so our messaging had to be vetted by these folks. Often it was very draining because our immediate impulse was to act or just respond. But the ability to pull back your emotions to make sure that the messaging passes through the filter of legal, compliance, and international affairs lenses helped us to really discipline ourselves when we were handling such a difficult and the emotional topic. So it was a first for us, and we literally grew through this whole experience. And yes, we had to hire some international, very high-level attorneys in London and in India just to walk us through this process.
You mentioned that if you don't know information in order to save yourself, that you kind of beat around the bush while you get that information. What would you suggest to do if once you get that information, it doesn't benefit you and what they were saying about you is true? How would you go about it? Would you still be truthful? Would you still say, yeah, I did that? Or would you kind of, because you said always tell the truth,
right.
So how would that work?
It's a great question. What do I stand for? What do I stand for? Do I want to be known as a person who, even when confronted with like compelling evidence, still not accept? We have many experiences and examples of people who tried to play around with words and say, I almost did that, I didn't. So when in doubt, this is my personal experience. When in doubt, just be the person who is willing to take, I'm sorry you felt that way, but this is what I thought. And always explain your stance, explain your perspective. And this is where your track record comes in. If you've always been a kind of a person who was very dodgy or who was like almost on the borderline and then your track record catches up. The world will never judge you on one instance. If it is the first time, you get a lot of currency for being the first time. I mean, even in a how many of you had the first traffic violation ever? A couple of you, right? If it is the first violation, you go in front of a judge and you plead. The first time you get away, right? Yes or no? There is clemency the first time. But after a while, if it's the second or third instance, the track record is speaking. You cannot plead clemency at that time. Yes or no? So you'd be judged on a series of incidents and your overall narrative than just one standoff, one standalone incident. So it really comes down to what narrative do you want to live by.
Cool. So, disgruntled employee, that situation, did ever threat of legal action ever cross your mind? Because you guys were, make a lot of money, your IPO. Did the threat of, cease and desist as far as them spreading any, how long did it take you to get to the bottom of that situation right there? And then you guys threaten legal action to, because they're messing up your money. So.
Sure. This actually happened in the second instance where I talked about the Dutch extradition request where they thought we were misusing the visa rules and provisions. So once we discovered that it stemmed from there, we actually went and told all our customers that this is a result of what happened, because that's the truth. The thing about truth is you can tell it as is. So we told our customers the truth. By then, that employee was already fired. So there wasn't much we could do because that employee was already fired. I mean, if he was still in the payroll and something, we could have disciplined or there could have been some impact. But he was already a disgruntled employee who left, who was fired. So there wasn't much we could do. But what we did go and talk in the Dutch media and to the Dutch trade representatives was the damage done to our brand. And once we kind of repaired and business as usual went on, we saw that even they realized that they acted in haste and caused immeasurable damage to us.
Now, that's a corrective action, but as far as preventive action, in hindsight, if you're working for another company, you want to release a new product, service, IPO. What should be done on all levels, from the executive to the functional? Say, like, listen, we're going to release we have a goal, February 16th, we want to release, first shares public to the public. What should you do to make sure any rumblings don't happen, come out in the public? What are the necessary steps that a company, CEO, marketing executive, whatever you guys should go to stop any bad talk about your IPO? What should be the necessary steps now that you know?
Oh, some of the lessons we learned was the ability to tightly manage information within a very closed set of people. The ability to communicate to employees just the amount that they need to know. The ability to make sure that employees do not have any access to any information beyond the scope of their duty. Some of those are clearly defined in companies now. For example, if let's say you go to India and you walk into some of our software factories, you wouldn't be able to use your phones to take a selfie or any such thing. Why? Because some of the work that is being done is on behalf of some top banks, top airline companies, top retail corporations around the world. So even if inadvertently, in the selfie, a screenshot of a computer on which some work is coming, that employee could potentially lose his job just for taking a selfie. So strict protocols are in place the way employees are managed in today's world. For example, there are a lot of bring your own device policies where you're allowed to take just a phone and an iPad, but you cannot take your MacBook or you cannot take your to work. And even if there are there are places where your USB drives, most laptops that are given, their USB drives are disabled because you cannot copy information. And if anyone is sending any information to their private email account from the company's systems, it's flagged. So today's technology allows you to monitor really at a very intense level what emails you might be sending. Just the subject and also just a few search phrases, we could mine what emails are going out of your system. In a sense, because when you sign up to work on behalf of a corporation, you're privy to that company's intellectual property. So you sign for it. Yep.
Okay, Sunil, let me ask you one final question, because you have shown us the interface between the organization and the person. So it is great that we should make sure that we are not really doing anything ridiculous on our social media and so on and so forth. What would you recommend if a person has already made that mistake? And I'm asking you as a practical suggestion because you are in the world of corporate communication. I had a terrible experience once. A student of mine had graduated and I wanted to get in touch with him, and I Googled him. And the first thing that came up was a mugshot, an arrest mugshot. And I managed to reach him and I said, that this is what comes up. And he says, I've been very distressed about it. I was arrested what he told me was they were fabricated charges and the charges were subsequently dropped, but that damn thing keeps coming up. So, present company excluded, but people who grew up at that point in time when social media was just coming, early 90s, so on and so forth, which is our demographic, have sometimes messed up. Yeah. Do you have any practical suggestions for them? And with that, we'll close. Go ahead.
Like I said, the digital imprint stays forever. Any post, any tweet, any verbal battles that you get into with folks on Facebook or something, they'll stay forever. And if you're applying for a corporation or a company where the HR folks or the legal folks, or some of you might consider public service, you are trying to get into a public office at some point, some of these will come back. And a couple of months ago, at the end of August, I was in Washington, D.C. attending a meeting, and we met a couple of people who were specifically hired. They are legal and technology people who were hired to screen and do intel on people whom the White House and some of these congressmen, the people on the Capitol Hill, they were hiring. So vetting today is so intense that you really want to be extra careful about. I'm not saying you shouldn't speak your convictions. If, like I was talking to you about earlier on, about you are judged by your convictions, beliefs, actions, track record, the whole picture. But oftentimes, indiscretions, like Professor was talking about, it was an unfortunate case where it was. So, for example, similar situations such as that, he really has to take legal help to try and get that print out, or even just get that updated to saying this was fabricated. So some bit of just like in the newspaper world, when in the heat of the moment reporters file stories, but then they add addendums later to say this story is updated to reflect this fact, right? So some bit of digital correction can be done, particularly if you've posted something, blogged something, and you have a different perspective. There are some remedial works that you could do. But like I always say, in Toastmasters, to wrap up my conclusion, in Toastmasters the rule is there are 3 topics that you try to stay away from: religion, sex, and politics. What is left? Right? Because on these 3 topics, pretty much everyone has a strong opinion. So depends on how you want to conduct the dialogue in a particularly public forum. Now, I can imagine if it's a closed door, if it's a different room, if you're messaging one-on-one, it's private. But if you are just leaving something out there for the world to see, it has to really reflect who you are and what you stand for. And you're willing to defend it tooth and nail till your last drop. And if those are your convictions, by all means. There are some convictions, like I shared today, I'm willing to stand up and defend those till the cows come home. But if they're not your convictions and you don't stand by them, then you've done a Walter fuss, all right? Thanks a lot. You've been a wonderful audience, and I really appreciate you. Thank you.
Okay, Sunil, on our behalf, thank you very much. So folks,
Thank you.
You can, those of you who are not, you can cut the feed. Those of you who